Morgan Freeman stepped into the small cafe nestled along a quiet San Francisco street, where the warm glow of the hanging lights cast a soft amber hue over the dark wooden walls, creating an atmosphere of both comfort and solitude. The faint chime of the doorbell rang as he pushed open the glass door, greeted instantly by the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee blending with the scent of warm pastries just out of the oven. He paused for a moment, inhaling deeply, allowing the familiar fragrance to wash over him, a ritual he had maintained throughout the years whenever he visited a new cafe. His eyes scanned the space, taking in the neatly arranged wooden tables, the barista working deftly behind the counter, and the slow hum of early morning conversation drifting from the handful of patrons seated around the room. He selected a quiet corner table by the window, a habit he had formed long ago, preferring to observe the world rather than be the center of attention. As he settled into his seat, Morgan retrieved his phone, glancing through a few messages, though his mind remained half-anchored in the ambient symphony of the cafe. The rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine, the distant chatter of patrons, the occasional clinking of ceramic cups. A steaming cup of black coffee was soon placed in front of him, and he acknowledged the server with a polite nod before wrapping his fingers around the warm ceramic. But just as he lifted the cup to his lips, something in the periphery of his vision caught his attention. Across the cafe, an elderly woman in a pale blue uniform and white apron moved with quiet diligence, wiping down the wooden tables with meticulous care. There was something strikingly familiar about the way she worked, the slight tilt of her wrist as she scrubbed a stubborn spot, the careful way she repositioned the chairs, the gentle but precise nature of her movements. Morgan's gaze lingered, a peculiar sense of déjà vu creeping over him, like a forgotten melody playing faintly in the back of his mind. Then she turned slightly, stepping into the light from the window, and his breath caught in his throat. It was Maribel Vega, the woman who had once been at the heart of his childhood, the woman who had bandaged his scraped knees, read him bedtime stories in her soothing melodic voice, and filled the gaps of his youth with unwavering kindness and patience. Time had traced deep lines across her face, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in the same neat bun she had always worn, but the warmth in her expression, the gentle, resilient presence that had once been his anchor, was unmistakable. For a moment, the world inside the cafe seemed to fade, replaced by a flood of long-buried memories. The quiet nights when she would sit beside his bed, humming softly as he drifted to sleep. The afternoons spent in the kitchen, where she would patiently teach him how to mix ingredients, not just for the sake of cooking, but to show him the joy of creating something from nothing. The evenings when she would comfort him after a tough day, reminding him that even the strongest minds needed kindness to thrive. And now, here she was, at 85 years old, still working, still moving with quiet dignity, still laboring away in the background of other people's lives. Morgan felt a pang of guilt tighten in his chest. While he had built a life of success and recognition, the woman who had shaped him, who had been a source of quiet strength in his formative years, had spent decades in obscurity, unseen and unrecognized. He placed his cup down gently, inhaling deeply to steady himself, then rose from his seat. His heart pounded, a mix of disbelief, gratitude, and sorrow swirling within him as he took slow, deliberate steps toward her. The past and present had collided in the most unexpected way, and in that moment Morgan Freeman knew this was not just a chance encounter. This was a reckoning with his past, a moment that would change everything. Morgan Freeman stood frozen in place, his breath caught somewhere between shock and disbelief as he stared at the elderly woman wiping down the cafe tables with quiet diligence. His heart pounded in his chest, a sensation so rare and unfamiliar that he almost mistook it for something else. Perhaps the effects of exhaustion from the long week, or maybe the strong black coffee he had barely sipped. But no, it wasn't fatigue or caffeine-induced jitters. It was the undeniable recognition of someone he had long believed to be lost to time. Maribel Vega. The name formed in his mind before his lips could catch up, his pulse quickening as he tried to reconcile the woman before him with the cherished memories he had tucked away in the farthest corners of his mind. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of composure, but at that moment, he felt utterly unguarded, vulnerable in a way that startled him. How was it possible that she was here, right in front of him, after all these years? And more than that, how was it possible that she was still working, her hands wrinkled with time and hardship, yet moving with the same careful precision he had known as a boy? The floodgates of memory burst open without warning, and suddenly, he was no longer standing in a small cafe in San Francisco. He was a child again, running through sunlit hallways, his laughter echoing as Maribel called after him, playfully scolding him for making a mess. He could still hear the warmth in her voice, the way she used to hum softly while preparing meals, the way she would kneel beside him to inspect a scraped knee with gentle hands, dabbing at the wound with a tenderness that made the pain disappear. He remembered the nights when he had been too restless to sleep, his young mind filled with dreams too big for his small frame, and she would sit beside his bed, stroking his hair as she whispered stories. Stories of perseverance, of courage, of men who dared to reach beyond what seemed possible. He had listened to her every word as if they were spells cast upon him, shaping his thoughts, his ambitions, his very sense of self. And yet, despite the years of love and care she had given him, he had lost her, not by choice, not through anger or forgetfulness, but through the cruel passage of time that had a way of sweeping away the people who had once been the center of our worlds. He had never stopped to wonder where she had gone, never questioned what had happened after she left. He had simply grown up, moved forward, built a life filled with accolades and success, while she had faded into the backdrop of his past, existing only in the remnants of childhood nostalgia. And now, here she was, not in the comfort of retirement, not surrounded by family and the peace she deserved, but working, still working. A sharp pang of guilt struck him, deep and unforgiving, settling in the pit of his stomach like a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. He had been celebrated, adored, and respected by millions, yet the woman who had helped shape him into the man he had become had been left behind, unseen and unsung. He thought of all the years he had spent looking forward, always chasing the next project, the next role, the next great endeavor, never once looking back to see if the people who had helped him along the way had been able to chase their own dreams. How had he let this happen? How had he allowed someone as important as Maribel to become just a name in the recesses of his memory? His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, Morgan felt an emotion he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge: helplessness. He had spent decades commanding the screen with a voice that could move mountains, yet at this moment, he struggled to find the words to bridge the impossible chasm that had formed between them over the years. What would he even say? I missed you? I'm sorry? Would that even be enough? Could any words possibly convey the depth of what he was feeling? And yet, standing there, watching her move with quiet dignity, he knew one thing for certain. He could not let this moment slip away. He could not allow her to remain in the shadows of his past any longer. Whether fate had brought them together again or simply cruel coincidence, he would not let her fade into obscurity once more. With a deep breath, he took a step forward, his hands slightly trembling at his sides. For the first time in a long time, he was uncertain of what would come next. But what he did know, what he was absolutely certain of, was that seeing Maribel again was not just a reunion. It was a reckoning. And whatever had been lost between them, whatever time had taken, he would do everything in his power to make it right. Morgan Freeman took a slow, measured breath, steadying himself as he stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the elderly woman who had once been such a vital part of his childhood. His voice, usually rich and commanding, softened with something unspoken as he called her name. Maribel Vega? The name left his lips with a mixture of hesitation and certainty, as if saying it aloud would make the moment real, would confirm that the woman before him was truly the same Maribel he had once known. The woman froze mid-wipe, her hand pausing against the surface of the table she had been cleaning, the rag held limply in her grasp. Slowly she turned, her brow furrowing as she took in the tall, silver-haired man standing before her, dressed in an understated yet unmistakably elegant way. Her deep brown eyes, weathered with years of life and experience, scanned his face, searching, questioning, and then something flickered within them. Recognition. "Morgan?" she whispered, her voice just a breath of sound, as though she scarcely believed it herself. The way she said his name sent a shiver down his spine, unlocking a flood of memories. He nodded, a small, almost disbelieving smile forming on his lips. Yes, it's me, Maribel. It's been a long time. His voice carried a weight of emotion he hadn't expected, thick with nostalgia, regret, and a longing for something he hadn't realized he had lost. Maribel's hands trembled as she slowly placed the rag down on the table, her gaze never leaving his. My boy, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion, as if seeing him had transported her back in time. I never thought I would see you again. Morgan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his chest tightening at her words. Neither did I, he admitted, shaking his head slightly, still trying to grasp the reality of the situation. His eyes roamed over her, taking in the lines on her face, the silver in her once dark hair, the weariness in her posture, and something deep inside him ached. Maribel, what are you doing here? Why are you still working? He hadn't meant for the question to sound as urgent as it did, but the thought of her still wiping tables at her age, after all she had done for him, gnawed at him relentlessly. Maribel let out a small chuckle, though there was little humor in it. She straightened her back slightly, a familiar pride flickering in her expression. Life happens, Morgan, she said simply. You do what you must. There was no bitterness in her tone, no resentment, only quiet acceptance. That, perhaps, was what unsettled him most. He wanted to push further, to demand why life had forced her into this situation, but he held back, sensing that now was not the time for such questions. Instead, he softened, his voice gentler as he asked, Can you take a break? Sit with me for a while? Maribel hesitated, glancing toward the counter where her manager stood watching the exchange with a puzzled expression. Morgan followed her gaze, then turned back to her with a small, reassuring smile. Please, just for a little while. Something in his tone must have reached her, because she finally nodded. All right, she murmured, just for a moment. They found a quiet corner of the cafe, away from the lingering customers, and as they sat, Morgan couldn't help but take another long look at her, as if to reassure himself that she was truly there. I can't believe this, he said, shaking his head. Of all the places, after all these years. Maribel smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. Fate works in mysterious ways, she said simply. And you, Morgan Freeman, have done well for yourself. Her pride was evident, and for a moment it felt as if they were back in time, as if she were still the same woman who had once fussed over him, encouraged him, believed in him before the rest of the world did. Morgan let out a small laugh, though it carried an edge of sadness. I've been fortunate, he admitted. But Maribel? I never thought. He hesitated, struggling to find the words. I never thought I'd find you like this. Maribel tilted her head, studying him. And how did you think you'd find me, mijo? The affectionate term, one she had used when he was just a boy, hit him like a wave. I thought, he exhaled slowly, looking down at his hands before meeting her gaze again, I thought you'd be somewhere warm, surrounded by family, enjoying the life you deserve. Maribel smiled, though there was a shadow behind it. We don't always get the life we deserve, Morgan, she said gently, but we do the best with what we have. He shook his head, his heart heavy. I should have looked for you, he admitted, the guilt pressing down on him like a weight. I should have. Maribel reached across the table, her hand covering his. Shh, mijo, she said softly. You had your life to live, and I had mine. Silence stretched between them for a moment, filled only by the hum of the cafe and the clinking of dishes. Finally, Morgan cleared his throat, his voice thick. Tell me about your life, Maribel. Everything I've missed. Maribel's eyes softened and she nodded, beginning to speak of the years that had passed, of the struggles and joys of the people she had cared for, of the loved ones she had lost. And Morgan listened, truly listened, as she wove the story of a life that had continued even in his absence, a life that deserved more than it had been given. And as they spoke, as they reconnected across the chasm of time, Morgan knew one thing for certain. This was not where their story would end. Not again, not this time. Morgan Freeman sat across from Maribel Vega, his mind struggling to fully grasp the weight of what she had just told him. 85 years old, still working long shifts at a cafe, still taking on extra cleaning jobs at night just to make ends meet. The words echoed in his mind, each syllable digging deeper into his chest. leaving an ache that he couldn't quite name. He had spent decades living in a world where his success had afforded him comfort, where people revered him, where he had the luxury of choosing how he spent his days. But Maribel, the woman who had once cradled him when he was scared, who had wiped his tears and whispered words of encouragement in his ear, who had nurtured his mind and heart when he was just a boy, was still scrubbing tables, still laboring under the weight of a world that had never rewarded her kindness the way it should have. His fingers curled into fists against the smooth surface of the table. He could feel the slow burn of anger simmering beneath his skin, an anger that had no clear target but was overwhelming nonetheless. How could this be? How could the same universe that had granted him such wealth, such success, have let someone like Maribel fall through the cracks? How could it be that after a lifetime of giving, of sacrificing, of putting others before herself, she was still forced to struggle for basic dignity? It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. And the unfairness of it all hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. He watched her as she took a small sip from the cup of tea the cafe provided for staff. Her hands, once so strong, so steady, now shaking slightly with age. He thought about those hands, about how they had once bandaged his scraped knees, had tucked blankets around his small frame, had pointed out constellations in the night sky as she told him stories of places far beyond their reach. He had idolized her as a child, had seen her as this unwavering force of warmth and wisdom, a guiding presence in his young life, and yet here she was, reduced to exhaustion, still pushing herself far beyond what any person should have to endure at her age. His mind spun back to his own journey, the accolades, the awards, the opportunities that had come his way. He thought about the extravagant homes, the luxury of choosing when and how he worked, the offers that still poured in, begging for his presence, his voice. How many times had he spoken about justice, about perseverance, about the human spirit? How many times had he stood before crowds, delivering words meant to inspire, to uplift? And yet here was Maribel, his own personal angel from childhood, living proof of an injustice he had somehow been blind to. His voice was tight when he finally spoke, the words pressing against his throat like they might choke him. "Why didn't you reach out to me, Maribel?" The question wasn't an accusation, it was a plea. He needed to understand how this had happened, how she had been left to face all of this alone. Maribel let out a small chuckle, shaking her head, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. "Mijo," she said gently, as if explaining something simple, something inevitable. "You had your own life to live. I never wanted to burden you." Burden. The word sent a sharp pang through him, as if she, of all people, could ever be a burden to him, as if he wouldn't have dropped everything to make sure she had everything she needed, to make sure she never had to lift another heavy tray, never had to spend another night on her feet scrubbing floors in an empty office building. The thought of her alone in the dead of night, surrounded by nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial cleaner, made his chest tighten unbearably. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Maribel, you are not a burden. You never were. If anything, I owe you more than I can ever repay." She reached out then, placing her frail hand over his, giving it a small squeeze. "You don't owe me anything, Morgan," she said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "You were always meant to do great things. I knew it from the moment you were a little boy, asking me all those questions, dreaming about the stars." She smiled, though there was a sadness to it, a quiet acceptance of the life she had lived. "And you did. You made something of yourself. That is more than enough for me." But it wasn't enough for him. Not now. Not after seeing this. His eyes drifted around the cafe, the chipped paint on the walls, the threadbare carpet, the way the other workers, all younger than her by decades, bustled around with a weariness that spoke of long hours and little pay. He knew how these places operated. He knew that people like Maribel, who had spent their entire lives working, were often given nothing in return when they needed it most. No safety net, no retirement, no sense of security after years of dedicating themselves to others. He thought about how different things could have been for her. If only someone had seen her the way he did. If only she had been given the same chances that life had given him. But fate had not been as kind to her. and that realization sat heavily on his shoulders, a burden he wasn't sure he could shake. His jaw tightened. No, this wasn't how her story was going to end. Not if he had anything to say about it. His mind was already working, forming plans, considering what he could do, how he could change this. Money? Of course, that was the obvious solution, but he knew Maribel well enough to know she wouldn't accept a handout. No, he had to be smarter about this, had to find a way to give her the dignity she deserved without making her feel like she was taking charity. His fingers drummed against the table as his thoughts raced. He needed to know more, needed to understand just how deep this situation went. "Where do you live now?" he asked, his voice careful, measured. Maribel hesitated before answering. "A small apartment in Oakland, nothing fancy, but it's home." He didn't miss the way she avoided his eyes, the way she said the words with just a little too much finality, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was him. He knew what that meant. He had seen it before. He nodded slowly, filing the information away. "And you work 2 jobs?" She sighed, but there was no self-pity in it, just fact. "Yes. The cafe during the day, cleaning at night, it pays the bills." It shouldn't have to, he thought bitterly. His grip on the table tightened as he forced himself to stay calm, to think rationally. This wasn't about just throwing money at a problem. This was about fixing it, for good. He met her gaze, his voice steady with quiet determination. "Maribel," he said, "things are going to change." She tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Morgan didn't know the full answer yet, not entirely, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away from this. He wasn't going to let Maribel spend another night struggling just to survive. He had spent a lifetime telling stories, playing characters, inspiring audiences with words. But now, here in this small cafe, facing the woman who had shaped his earliest years, he realized this was no script, no performance. This was real. And for the first time in a long, long time, he had a chance to rewrite the ending of someone's story. And he was going to make sure it was a story worth telling. Morgan Freeman sat in the quiet of his hotel room later that evening, staring out at the San Francisco skyline. But his mind was thousands of miles away, and decades in the past. The meeting with Maribel Vega had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't let himself think about in years. As a child, life had often felt uncertain, but Maribel had been his anchor, his safe place, the one person who made him feel seen in a world that didn't always have time for a curious, sensitive boy with dreams bigger than the reality he had been born into. He could still hear the soft hum of her voice as she sang lullabies in Spanish, the same ones she had sung to him when he was a child and couldn't sleep, soothing him when the nights felt too long and the world outside too harsh. She had been there when he had scraped his knees playing outside, her hands gentle but firm as she cleaned the wounds, scolding him lightly for being careless while simultaneously comforting him with a warmth no bandage could provide. She was the one who had told him that pain was temporary, that healing always came with time, but that he had to be strong enough to endure the waiting. It was Maribel who had taught him to love stories, to appreciate the magic of words and the power they held. She had been the first person to ever truly listen to him when he spoke, never brushing aside his endless questions, never dismissing his thoughts as childish or foolish. When he had asked about the stars, she had told him their names, explaining constellations with a patience that rivaled any teacher. When he had asked why people sometimes did cruel things, she had looked him in the eye and said, "Because they forget to see the humanity in others. You must never forget, mijo. Always see people for who they are, not just what they seem to be." He had carried those words with him long after childhood, long after he had left the world he had known behind to pursue something bigger. He thought of the times he had come home from school, frustrated or angry at the world, only for Maribel to pull him into the kitchen, placing a rolling pin in his small hands and telling him, "Knead the dough, Morgan. Work your feelings into it." Cooking is not just about food. It's about patience, about learning to create something out of almost nothing. She had taught him resilience without ever using the word, showing him that every challenge could be met with grace, that failure was not something to fear, but something to learn from. He remembered one particular day when he had been no more than 9 years old, furious at a teacher who had dismissed his dreams as unrealistic, telling him that kids like him, kids who didn't come from wealth or privilege, didn't end up in places of power. He had stormed into the house, tears hot in his eyes, yelling that it wasn't fair, that the world had already decided his fate before he even had a chance. Maribel had listened patiently, letting him pour out his anger before placing a hand on his shoulder. "The world will always try to tell you who you are, mijo," she had said. "But it is you who decides if they are right. If you believe in something, you fight for it. No one gets to take your dreams away from you unless you let them." He had never forgotten that. It had shaped him in ways he hadn't even realized at the time. It was Maribel's voice that had stayed with him when the doors of opportunity seemed closed, when rejection and hardship had made the road to success feel impossible. She had been the first person to teach him the power of perseverance, the first to make him understand that dignity came not from what the world gave you, but from what you refused to let it take away. And now, all these years later, he saw that same quiet dignity in her, working through exhaustion, refusing to let life strip her of the pride she had carried for so long. The thought of her laboring through double shifts at her age, of her hands once so strong and steady, now trembling with the weight of years, filled him with a sadness he could not shake. She had given so much, not just to him, but to the world, and yet, in the end, the world had given her so little in return. He thought about all the lessons she had taught him, about resilience, about kindness, about never giving up on his dreams. And he realized that now it was his turn. He could not erase the years of struggle she had endured, but he could change what came next. Because if Maribel had taught him anything, it was that doing nothing in the face of injustice was never an option. He had the power to change her life, and he would. He owed her that much. No, he owed her more. After leaving Morgan Freeman's childhood home, Maribel Vega's life became a series of relentless struggles, each one demanding more resilience than the last. She had been forced to leave behind the boy she had cared for, the child she had watched grow with such promise, and she had done so without a proper goodbye. It was not by choice. Circumstances had dictated her fate, as they always had, pushing her forward into an uncertain future. At first she had secured work with another family, caring for children much like she had done for Morgan. But it had never been the same. The bond she had formed with him was rare, something deeper than just employment, something maternal, something unbreakable, despite the distance. Yet life was unkind, and there was no time for sentimentality when survival demanded all of her energy. She moved from house to house, working as a nanny for wealthy families who rarely saw her as anything more than hired help. Some treated her with respect, others with indifference, but none ever understood the depth of the love she had once given so freely. The years passed, and she grew older, her body less willing to endure the long hours, but she had no choice. Without savings, without a pension, she had to keep going. When she was in her 50s, she transitioned from childcare to housekeeping, hoping the work would be less taxing, but it was just as demanding in different ways. Her hands, once gentle and steady, became rough from endless scrubbing. Her knees ached from bending, her back throbbed from carrying heavy loads. She had no one to care for her the way she had cared for so many others. The children she had raised moved on, forgetting her as they stepped into the comfort of their privileged lives, while she remained behind, invisible in the background of their memories. In her 60s, when many were retiring, Maribel was still waking up before dawn, catching buses to cleaning jobs that paid too little, leaving her exhausted before the day had even truly begun. She had lost friends over the years, some to distance, others to time, and a few to the inevitable call of age. Loneliness became her companion, whispering to her in the quiet moments between shifts, reminding her that she had spent her life giving, and receiving so little in return. Yet she never complained. Life had never been fair, but she had always found a way to survive. When she reached her 70s, her body rebelled against the years of labor. Arthritis crept into her joints, slowing her down, making every movement a reminder of how much time had passed. Her vision blurred at the edges, her hearing dulled, but she pushed forward. She had no other option. She picked up work as a night janitor, cleaning office buildings after the corporate world had gone home. The work was isolating, but it allowed her to avoid the watchful eyes of those who might pity her. Pity was something she could not bear. She had lived with dignity, and she would continue to do so, even if it meant breaking herself in the process. By the time she was 80, she had lost track of how many floors she had scrubbed, how many tables she had wiped down, how many nights she had spent in silence, surrounded by the echoes of a world that had long since moved past her. Her hands trembled more now, not just from age but from exhaustion, from a lifetime of work that had given her no rest. But she would not stop. She could not stop. There were bills to pay, rent that never stopped increasing, medical expenses she could barely afford. Every month was a battle to stay afloat. She had thought once that maybe she would return to the places of her youth, to the people she had left behind. But time had taken them. Just as it had taken so much else, the only thing that remained was the quiet resolve in her heart. The same resolve that had carried her through decades of hardship. And so, she continued, never expecting that the past she had left behind would one day walk through the doors of the small cafe where she now worked, bringing with it memories she had buried and a reminder that some bonds, no matter how tested by time, could never truly be broken. Morgan Freeman sat in the back seat of his car, staring out at the city that had once felt like his playground, now realizing how much he had overlooked. His mind was restless, unable to move past what he had just witnessed. Maribel Vega, the woman who had once been the most nurturing presence in his young life, still working tirelessly at the age of 85, bending over tables and carrying trays with hands that had once held his when he was a scared little boy. The reality of it hit him like a punch to the gut. How was it possible that while he had risen to unimaginable heights, she had been left behind to struggle in obscurity? He had spent decades living a life of success, of influence, of luxury, and yet the person who had shaped so much of who he was had been enduring years of quiet hardship. The weight of it settled heavily in his chest. He had always thought of her as someone who would be okay, someone who would find her way just as he had, but the truth was far more brutal than anything he could have imagined. He couldn't shake the image of her hunched shoulders, the fatigue in her steps, the tired smile she wore as if it were armor against a world that had forgotten her. He had to know more. He had to understand how she had ended up here. Reaching for his phone, he called his assistant, his voice low but urgent. I need everything you can find on a woman named Maribel Vega, her current address, her work history, any records available. Quietly, he knew Maribel. He knew she was proud, fiercely independent. If she had wanted his help, she would have found a way to ask. But she hadn't. That meant he had to be careful. He couldn't simply throw money at the problem or offer a grand gesture. No, she would never accept that. He needed to approach this differently, to understand her life before he could figure out how to make a real difference. As the car moved through the streets, he found himself thinking back to their conversation. She had spoken so casually about working 2 jobs, as if exhaustion were just another part of her routine, something she had learned to live with. She had waved off his concern the way she used to when she told him not to worry about scraped knees or bad dreams, as if her own struggles were not worth mentioning. But he had seen through it. He had seen the way she winced when lifting the heavy tray, the way she leaned against the counter for just a second too long, as if gathering the strength to keep going. No, she was not okay, and he could not just walk away knowing that. When his phone buzzed with a message an hour later, he read the information with growing unease. Maribel lived in a small apartment in a run-down part of the city, barely making ends meet on the wages from her cafe job and her night shifts cleaning office buildings. There were no family members listed as dependents, no records of any significant savings or retirement funds. She had spent a lifetime working, but in the end she had been left with almost nothing. The injustice of it burned in his chest. How could a woman who had given so much of herself, who had dedicated her life to caring for others, be forced to work into her 80s just to survive? It was a cruel irony, one that he could not ignore. He made his decision then and there. He would not let this be the way her story ended. But the question remained, how could he help without making her feel like a charity case? He knew Maribel, and he knew she would resist anything that made her feel like a burden. She had spent her whole life standing on her own 2 feet, and he would not dishonor that. Instead, he needed to find a way to integrate her into his world again, to create an opportunity that allowed her to retain her independence while ensuring that she would never have to struggle another day in her life. The answer, he realized, lay not just in financial assistance, but in restoring to her the dignity and purpose that had carried her through all these years. Leaning back in his seat, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, already planning his next steps. First, he needed to see where she lived, to understand just how difficult her situation truly was. Then, he would find a way to bring her back into his life, not just as someone he wanted to help, but as someone whose wisdom, experience, and kindness still had so much value. Maribel Vega was not just another name on a list of people in need. She was family, the closest thing to a mother he had ever known, and he would not fail her again. The years had separated them, but now that he had found her again, he was determined to make sure she never felt alone or forgotten ever again. Morgan Freeman sat in his quiet study, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room as he scrolled through his phone, debating his next move. He had spent the past few days consumed by thoughts of Maribel Vega, trying to piece together how the woman who had once been the center of his childhood had ended up spending her later years in such hardship. The questions gnawed at him, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was something missing from the story. He had been too young to understand the circumstances back then, but now, with the benefit of age and experience, he recognized that her sudden departure from his life had never made sense. It had been abrupt, without warning, and no one had ever really explained why. His mother had brushed it off as complicated adult matters, and his father had never spoken of it at all. But now, as he sat there, he knew that he needed answers. Real answers. Without hesitation, he dialed the number of a private investigator he had worked with before, a man who had a reputation for uncovering truths that others preferred to keep buried. "I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Maribel Vega," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "She worked for my family decades ago and left under circumstances that don't add up. I need to know why." The investigator took down the details and assured Morgan that he would begin immediately. As he ended the call, Morgan felt a strange mix of anticipation and apprehension. Part of him feared what he might uncover. What if the truth was worse than he imagined? What if Maribel had been forced out, mistreated, or even betrayed by the very people he had once trusted? He had always assumed that life had simply pulled them in different directions, but now, for the first time, he was beginning to suspect that there had been something more deliberate at play. Days passed, and Morgan went about his usual obligations, but his thoughts remained tethered to the unanswered questions. Then, late one evening, his phone buzzed with a message from the investigator. "I found something. We need to talk." A cold unease settled in Morgan's chest as he called back immediately. "What did you find?" he asked, bracing himself. "It's not what you were expecting," the investigator said. "Maribel didn't just leave your family, she was forced out." The words sent a chill down Morgan's spine. "What do you mean?" he pressed. "According to old employment records and witness statements, she was dismissed abruptly. No notice, no severance, nothing. But what's interesting is that there are no official termination papers. It's like she just disappeared from the household records overnight." Morgan's grip tightened around his phone. "That doesn't make any sense. She was with us for years. Why would she suddenly be let go like that?" The investigator hesitated before answering. "I think you already suspect the answer, Mr. Freeman. Your father. There are indications that Maribel had multiple conflicts with him, and from what I've gathered, she wasn't just a caregiver. She was your protector. Your account suggesting that she intervened more than once when your father was being difficult with you." Morgan felt a sharp pang in his chest. He knew exactly what that meant. His father had been a hard man, strict to the point of being overbearing, and while he had always respected him, he had never felt truly safe in his presence. Maribel, on the other hand, had been his refuge. She had been the one who had shielded him, comforted him, and encouraged his curiosity when others dismissed it. "She stood up to him," Morgan said, realization dawning. "She did," the investigator confirmed. And from what I can piece together, that was her undoing. There was an incident, one that seemed to have been the final straw, a confrontation. After that, she was gone. No explanation, no chance to say goodbye. Morgan's jaw clenched as the weight of the revelation settled over him. All these years, he had assumed that Maribel had simply moved on, found a better opportunity, or chosen to leave for reasons of her own. But the truth was far more painful. She had been ripped from his life because she had dared to protect him. The injustice of it burned in his chest. "What happened to her after she left?" he asked, his voice quieter now. The investigator sighed. "She struggled. Without references from your family, it was difficult for her to find work of the same kind. She took on whatever job she could, cleaning, caregiving, anything that would keep her afloat. She eventually made her way to the U.S., where she built a life for herself. But it was never easy. She never had stability, never had security. And she never spoke about what happened. Not to anyone." Morgan swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He thought of the elderly woman he had seen scrubbing tables at the cafe, the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet dignity in the way she carried herself despite everything. She had sacrificed so much, endured so much, and she had done it all alone. And yet, she had never once reached out to him. Had she thought he had forgotten her? Had she believed he wouldn't care? "I need to see her," he said, determination rising within him. "And I need you to find out more. I want every detail about what my father did. I need to know the whole story." "Understood," the investigator replied. "I'll keep digging." As Morgan ended the call, he sat in silence, staring at the city lights beyond his window. The past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you tried to run from it. But now he wasn't running, he was facing it head on. He had spent his life telling stories, bringing truth to light through his work. But this was personal. He owed Maribel more than just gratitude. He owed her justice. And he would not rest until he made things right. Morgan Freeman sat alone in his study, the weight of the past pressing down on him as he stared at the worn envelope in his hands. The letter had been buried in the depths of time, hidden away in a place where secrets went to be forgotten. But now, after decades of living under a truth he had never questioned, he was about to confront the reality that had been kept from him all his life. His mother's handwriting was unmistakable on the front, delicate yet firm, her familiar script evoking memories of a childhood that suddenly seemed further away than ever. With a slow, deliberate breath, he unfolded the fragile paper inside, his hand steady but his heart racing. As his eyes scanned the first few lines, the world around him seemed to blur, as if time itself was bending under the weight of the revelation that was about to change everything he thought he knew about himself. The words on the page were clear, yet his mind struggled to process them. His father, the man who had raised him, whose approval he had sought, whose discipline had shaped him, was not his biological father. His real father was someone else, a name he had never heard before, a man who had vanished from his life before he had ever known of his existence. The letter, written by his mother long ago but never sent, detailed the truth with a kind of quiet sorrow. She had met his real father when she was young, before she had married the man Morgan had always known as his father. Their love had been brief but intense, a fleeting moment of passion and connection that had left her with a child, Morgan. But circumstances, expectations, and the world's rigid rules had forced her into a different path. She had married another man, one who had given Morgan his name but not his blood. Morgan felt his breath hitch as the truth settled over him like an unbearable weight. The man he had spent his whole life trying to understand, the man whose voice had been a mix of authority and disappointment, had never truly been his father. And yet the pain of his childhood, the sternness, the cold distance, it all suddenly made sense. Had his father always known the truth? Had he resented Morgan for being another man's child? Was that why he had never quite embraced him the way he had his siblings? The pieces were falling into place, but they weren't forming a picture of clarity. Only a deeper confusion, a well of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. His mind raced back to moments from his past, memories now tinted with a different shade of meaning. He thought of the way his father had looked at him sometimes, a gaze that carried something unspoken, something heavier than mere parental expectation. He thought of the times he had felt like an outsider in his own home, the countless moments where he had wondered why he never quite fit in. The truth had been there all along, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for him to see it, and now that he had, he couldn't unsee it. A sharp pang of sorrow gripped his chest as another thought crossed his mind. Maribel. She had been there through it all, his anchor in a storm he hadn't even realized he was weathering. Had she known? Had she kept this secret along with his mother, shielding him from a truth that might have shattered him as a child? The thought of her enduring that burden alone, all while being forced out of his life for reasons he was only now beginning to understand, filled him with both gratitude and heartbreak. She had protected him in ways he had never known, sacrificing her own security to ensure his well-being, and yet in the end, she had been cast aside, abandoned to fend for herself, while he had been left in the dark. Morgan leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply as he closed his eyes. The past had caught up with him, and now he had to face it. There was no running from this, no turning away from the truth. He had spent his life telling stories, unraveling the complexities of human nature on the screen and the stage, but this was his own story, and it was far from over. The questions swirled in his mind, demanding answers. Who was his real father? What kind of man had he been? Had he ever wanted to be part of Morgan's life, or had he left willingly? And most of all, what would Morgan do with this truth now that he had it? The revelation didn't change who he was, but it reshaped the foundation of his existence. It was like discovering that the ground he had walked on his whole life had always been an illusion, a carefully constructed reality designed to protect him, or perhaps to protect those who had kept the secret. He thought of his mother, of the pain she must have carried, of the choices she had made out of necessity rather than desire. He thought of his father, of the bitterness and resentment that might have festered beneath his strict exterior. And he thought of Maribel, of the unwavering love she had shown him, of the truth she had carried, without ever allowing it to weigh him down. Morgan ran a hand over his face, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. He had spent a lifetime building a legacy, crafting a name for himself in the world, but now he had to rebuild something far more personal, his understanding of himself. He needed to talk to his mother, to hear the truth from her lips, to understand why she had kept this from him. And he needed to see Maribel again, to thank her for the silent protection she had given him, for the love that had never wavered even when she had been cast aside. He folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the envelope with a reverence he hadn't expected. This piece of paper, aged and fragile, had changed everything, but as he stood and looked out the window into the vast night sky, he realized that it had also given him something, a chance to make peace with the past, to seek out the missing pieces of his story, and to honor the people who had shaped him, even in silence. The truth had been hidden for far too long. Now, it was time to bring it into the light. Maribel Vega had always known how to stand her ground, but facing Morgan Freeman's father was a battle she never thought she would have to fight. She had spent years in the Freeman household, raising Morgan with all the love and care she had in her heart, shielding him from the harsh realities of his home life as much as she could. From the moment she first held him in her arms as a little boy, she had known that he was different. Not just intelligent, but deeply sensitive, a child who saw the world with wonder and curiosity rather than fear and rigidity. She had protected that spark in him, nurtured his dreams, encouraged his questions, and taught him that kindness and imagination were strengths, not weaknesses. But Morgan's father, stern, controlling, and distant, had never seen it that way. He had wanted a different kind of son, one who conformed to his expectations, one who obeyed without question, one who didn't challenge the world but accepted it as it was. And it was that fundamental difference that had led to Maribel standing in front of him on that fateful night, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. The argument had started earlier in the evening when Morgan's father had returned home in one of his usual foul moods. It wasn't uncommon. His temper was something the entire household had learned to navigate, like sailors adjusting their course to avoid a brewing storm. Maribel had always been careful, always keeping Morgan occupied in another room, away from the worst of it. But that night, something had changed. She had found Morgan sitting quietly in his room, his shoulders hunched, a fresh bruise on his arm that he tried to hide when she entered. Her heart had clenched with fear and anger, and for the first time she knew she couldn't remain silent any longer. She knelt beside him, gently brushing her fingers over the tender skin. "Nino, tell me what happened," she whispered. But Morgan only shook his head. She didn't need him to say it. She already knew. That was when she made the decision. She had swallowed her own fear and marched downstairs to the study where Morgan's father sat, whiskey in hand, his presence filling the room with an air of dominance. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. He barely looked up. "About what?" Maribel took a deep breath, her hands clenched at her sides. "About the way you treat your son." That got his attention. He set his glass down with deliberate slowness, finally looking at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "My son?" he repeated, as if tasting the words. "And what business is it of yours, Maribel?" "It's my business because I love him," she said without hesitation, "because I have watched him grow, and I see the light in him that you refuse to acknowledge. He is not weak. He is not a failure. He is a brilliant boy, a kind boy, and you are breaking him." A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. "Breaking him? You think I'm too hard on him?" He leaned back in his chair, regarding her with something between amusement and disdain. "You have no idea what it takes to raise a man in this world, Maribel. You coddle him, fill his head with nonsense. You think you're protecting him, but you're making him soft." Maribel shook her head, her chest tightening with frustration. "No, I am making him strong, a different kind of strong than what you understand. Strength is not cruelty. Strength is not fear. Strength is having the courage to be yourself, to dream, to create, to lead with kindness instead of force." He slammed his hand down on the desk, his patience finally snapping. "Enough!" His voice boomed through the room, but Maribel didn't flinch. She had spent years enduring his moods, but tonight she would not be intimidated. "You are forgetting your place, Maribel." "No," she said firmly, "I know exactly where I stand, and I know that if you continue treating Morgan this way, you will lose him." Something flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Doubt? Guilt? Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold, hardened expression she had seen too many times before. He rose from his chair and stepped toward her, his presence looming. "You have become a problem," he said quietly, "and I do not tolerate problems in my house." Maribel's breath caught, but she stood her ground. "What are you saying? You need to leave." The words struck like a blow, knocking the air from her lungs. "You can't." "I can," he interrupted, "and I will. As of tomorrow morning, you will no longer be welcome in this house. You will not see Morgan again. Do you understand?" Panic surged through her, but she kept her voice steady. "You can send me away, but you cannot erase me from his heart. He will remember, and one day he will see you for who you truly are." For a moment they stared at each other, a silent battle waging between them. Then his lips curled into something that might have been a smirk. "Perhaps. But by then it will be too late. He will be a man by my making, not yours." Maribel wanted to fight, wanted to scream, but she knew it was futile. He held all the power. If she resisted, he would make things worse, not just for her, but for Morgan. And so with a final look of defiance, she turned and walked out of the room, knowing that this was the last time she would stand in this house, the last time she would hear the echoes of Morgan's laughter in the hallways. That night she packed her things in silence, her heart breaking with every folded piece of clothing, every small trinket that carried a memory. She wanted to wake Morgan, to tell him goodbye, to hold him one last time. But she knew she couldn't. If she did, he would cry, he would beg her to stay, and she wouldn't be able to say no. So instead, she stood at the doorway of his room, watching him sleep, memorizing every detail of his peaceful face, whispering a promise into the night. "You will be great, Nino. No matter what he tells you, no matter what the world says, you will shine." And then, before the morning light could expose her sorrow, she was gone. Morgan Freeman sat across from Maribel Vega and his mother, the weight of decades of secrecy pressing down on the room like a heavy fog. He had spent his entire life believing one version of his past, carrying memories that now felt incomplete, altered by the truth that had been hidden from him. His heart pounded as he tried to form the right words, but the emotions swirling inside him made it nearly impossible. He looked at the two women before him, one who had raised him with warmth and love when his father had been cold and distant, and the other who had carried the burden of a painful decision for years, never telling him the full truth about his origins. His mother's hands were folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her lips pressed together as if holding back words she still wasn't sure she was ready to say. Maribel, on the other hand, looked at him with eyes filled with the quiet strength he had always known, eyes that had once comforted him as a child, that had reassured him when he doubted himself, that had carried a love he never fully understood until now. "So, all these years," Morgan finally spoke, his voice quieter than he expected, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile reality before him. "I was living a lie." His mother flinched at his words, but did not immediately deny them. Instead, she let out a slow breath, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It was never a lie, Morgan," she said softly. "It was just a truth I thought was best left buried." Morgan let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Best for whom? For you? For him?" His voice tightened as he mentioned the man he had called his father for so long, the man who had shaped him through absence rather than presence, through strictness rather than love. "Because it certainly wasn't best for me." His mother's eyes welled with tears, but she did not look away. "I did what I thought was right. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Morgan demanded, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "From knowing the truth about who I am? From knowing that the man I spent my whole life trying to impress wasn't even my real father?" He turned to Maribel now, searching for answers in her face, in the eyes that had always told him the truth, even when no one else would. "And you? You knew, didn't you?" Maribel swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table, as if grounding herself. "Yes, Nino," she said gently, using the old nickname that softened something inside him, even as his anger fought to hold on. "I knew. Then why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because it wasn't my truth to tell," she said simply. "Because your mother asked me not to. Because I was afraid that knowing the truth too soon would only bring you pain." Morgan closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I spent my whole life believing I had to be something I wasn't," he murmured. "I worked so hard to prove myself to a man who never even saw me, who never really wanted me." His mother's tears finally spilled over as she reached for his hand, but he pulled away, not ready for comfort just yet. "Morgan, listen to me," she pleaded. "Your father, Errol, he may not have been your blood, but he raised you. I know he wasn't perfect, I know he hurt you in ways I wish he hadn't, but he was still the man who gave you his name, who what?" Morgan cut in, his voice laced with bitterness. "Who made me feel like I was never enough, who treated me like a stranger in his own house." He shook his head. "That's not love, Mama. That's not family." Maribel reached for him then, her touch warm, steady. "But you were always enough," she said firmly. "You were always meant to be more than what he saw in you. I knew it from the moment I met you, Nino, and that's why I stayed as long as I could. That's why I fought for you, why I stood up to him." Morgan looked at her, seeing the truth in her eyes, the unwavering love that had always been there. "And that's why he forced you to leave," he said softly, realization dawning. "Because you wouldn't let him break me." Maribel nodded, her lips pressed together as she held back her own emotions. "Yes. He saw me as a threat, as someone who would undo everything he was trying to teach you, and he couldn't allow that." Morgan turned back to his mother, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "And you let it happen." His mother's face crumbled, guilt washing over her like a wave. "I didn't have a choice, Morgan. I was scared. I was trapped in a marriage that was falling apart with a man who held all the power. I had to pick my battles, and at the time I thought keeping you safe meant keeping you close, even if it meant losing Maribel." Morgan wanted to hold on to his anger, wanted to let the resentment fester, but when he looked at his mother, really looked at her, He saw the woman who had also suffered under his father's rule, the woman who had done the best she could with what little agency she had. He saw her pain, her regret, and he knew that holding on to anger wouldn't change the past. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I don't know how to process all of this," he admitted, running a hand over his face. "It feels like my whole life has shifted." Maribel gave his hand a small squeeze. "It doesn't change who you are, Nino," she said softly. "It doesn't change what you have built, what you have become." His mother nodded. "And it doesn't change how much I love you," she whispered. Morgan swallowed the lump in his throat, looking between the two women who had shaped him in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. The past was painful, full of wounds that would take time to heal, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was seeing the full picture, like he was finally standing on solid ground. He exhaled deeply and, slowly, reached for both of their hands, gripping them tightly. "I just need time," he said. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone in facing the truth. Morgan Freeman sat in his study, staring out the large window at the fading light of the evening sky, deep in thought about the best way to help Maribel Vega without making her feel as though he was offering charity. The last thing he wanted was to insult her pride, to make her feel like a burden when in truth she had been a pillar of his childhood. She was a woman of strength, resilience, and dignity, someone who had sacrificed so much for him without ever expecting anything in return. He owed her more than just comfort in her final years. He owed her security, peace, and the recognition she had been denied for decades. But he knew Maribel well enough to understand that she would never simply take money from him, no matter how much she needed it. She had spent her entire life working hard, earning every cent with the sweat of her brow. The idea of accepting help, even from someone she had once considered family, would be foreign to her. Morgan leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the polished wood of his desk as he formulated a plan. One that would allow Maribel to retain her dignity while still ensuring she never had to work another exhausting shift in a cafe or scrub office floors late into the night. He needed to create an opportunity that would allow her to feel like she was contributing rather than simply receiving. He thought back to their conversation, to the way her eyes had lit up when she spoke about Lucia, her grandniece, and the sacrifices she had made to ensure the young woman had a chance at an education. That was where the key lay. If he could help Maribel through Lucia, if he could provide the young woman with the opportunities she deserved, then Maribel might be more willing to accept his assistance. He made a note to reach out to the admissions office at MIT to see if there was any way to reinstate Lucia's scholarship. He could pull a few strings, fund an anonymous grant if necessary. It would be a start, a way to show Maribel that he wasn't just throwing money at her problems, but was instead investing in her legacy, in the future of someone she loved. But that alone wasn't enough. Maribel herself needed something more, something that would allow her to feel valued, needed. He recalled the way she had always been so patient with him as a child, the way she had nurtured his curiosity, encouraged him to explore his ideas. She had been more than just a caretaker, she had been a teacher, a mentor. What if he could offer her a role that allowed her to do that once more? A position where she could share her wisdom, her life experience, in a way that felt meaningful? An idea began to take shape. He had been considering launching a new initiative, one that focused on providing support and mentorship for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, helping them navigate the world with the kind of guidance that had been so crucial in his own life. Maribel could play an integral role in this. He would propose the idea as a partnership rather than an act of charity, positioning her as a key figure in shaping the program. It wouldn't be just a job, it would be a purpose. A way for her to continue doing what she had always done best, caring, guiding, and inspiring. But he knew he had to be careful in how he presented it to her. If she sensed that this was just a way for him to take care of her under the guise of work, she would reject it outright. It had to be something real, something she could believe in. He decided to frame it as a way to help others, to give back to the community, and to ensure that no child ever felt lost or abandoned in the way he once had. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that this was the right approach. He would buy the cafe where she worked, not to shut it down, but to transform it into something new, something that served a greater purpose. He imagined it as a community space, a place where young people could come for mentorship, where they could learn life skills, financial literacy, and personal development. Maribel could oversee it, shaping it into a hub of opportunity rather than just another coffee shop. It would be a tribute to her and the values she had instilled in him. He would make sure that she had a comfortable place to live, whether that meant renovating her current home or finding her a new one in a better neighborhood. But he wouldn't just offer it outright. He would make it part of the initiative, a residence tied to the program, a home for mentors and educators who dedicated their time to guiding the next generation. That way, she wouldn't feel like it was just for her. She would see it as part of something bigger, something she was actively contributing to. He knew this plan wouldn't erase the years of hardship she had endured, but it could at least ensure that she never had to struggle again. More than that, it could give her a sense of fulfillment, a way to spend her remaining years doing something she truly loved. As he finalized his thoughts, he felt a sense of clarity wash over him. This wasn't about repaying a debt, because no amount of money or effort could ever truly repay what Maribel had given him. This was about honoring her, about making sure that the world recognized her the way he always had. With a determined nod, he reached for his phone and made the first call to set the plan in motion. Whatever it took, he would make sure that Maribel Vega spent the rest of her days in comfort, surrounded by the respect and love she had always deserved. Maribel Vega sat across from Morgan Freeman in the small, sunlit kitchen of her modest apartment, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm but firm. She had listened patiently as he laid out his carefully crafted plan, explaining how he wanted to help her, how he had already set things in motion to ensure she would never have to work another exhausting shift again. But as soon as he finished speaking, she shook her head with quiet determination. "No, Morgan," she said softly but firmly, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience and a lifetime of hard-earned pride. Morgan frowned, confused. He had anticipated some resistance. He knew Maribel's pride would make it difficult for her to accept help, but he hadn't expected such an immediate and unwavering refusal. "Maribel," he began, his voice gentle, "I'm not just handing you money. This is an opportunity, something meaningful that you can be a part of." She sighed, her gaze steady as she studied him. "I know you mean well, mijo, but I cannot accept this." Morgan leaned forward, searching her face for some clue as to why she was so unwilling to take what she so clearly needed. "Why not?" he asked, trying to understand. "You shouldn't have to work yourself to exhaustion at this age. You've done more than enough." Maribel gave him a small, tired smile, as if she had been expecting this reaction. "Morgan, listen to me," she said, her voice patient but resolute. "You see my life now and you think it's unfair, that I deserve better, and maybe you're right, but what you don't understand is that everything I have, everything I am, I built with my own hands. I never wanted to be dependent on anyone, not when I was young, and certainly not now." Morgan shook his head. "But you shouldn't have to struggle, Maribel. Not after everything you've given to others, to me." She reached across the table, placing her weathered hand over his. "And that is why I am proud of you, Morgan," she said softly. "Because you remember. Because you care. But there is a difference between helping someone and taking away their independence. I have worked hard my whole life, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because work gives life purpose. It keeps us moving, keeps us feeling needed." Morgan exhaled, rubbing a hand across his face. "Maribel, I'm not trying to take away your independence. I just want to make sure you're okay." Maribel nodded slowly. "And I appreciate that, truly. But you must understand something. If I accept this, if I take this life you want to give me, what happens to the part of me that has always stood on my own 2 feet? What happens to the woman who has faced every storm and come out stronger on the other side?" Morgan looked at her, realizing that she wasn't just rejecting his help, she was teaching him something, just as she always had when he was a child. This wasn't about money or security. It was about dignity, about the deep, unshakable belief that one's worth was tied to one's ability to stand on their own. "I don't want to take anything from you, Maribel," he said after a moment. "I just want to give back what you gave me." She smiled again, this time with warmth. "And you already have, Morgan. Just by remembering me, by finding me, by showing me that what I did mattered. That is enough." He felt a lump rise in his throat, because he knew she meant it. To her, the fact that he had come back into her life, that he had recognized the sacrifices she had made, was more valuable than any financial security he could offer. But he wasn't ready to give up. "What if," he said carefully, "instead of helping you, I ask you to help me?" Maribel raised an eyebrow. "Help you how?" He leaned forward. "You were always the one who taught me how to think, how to see the world differently. I need that now. I need someone like you to help me with something important. It wouldn't be charity, Maribel. It would be a job. One that only you can do." She studied him for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether or not she believed him. Finally, she sighed. "Tell me more." And Morgan knew that this was the only way, by honoring her strength rather than trying to protect her from struggle, by making her feel valuable rather than just taken care of. Because Maribel Vega was not someone who needed saving. She was someone who had already saved herself, time and time again. Morgan Freeman sat in his quiet study, staring out the large window as the late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Maribel Vega's words echoed in his mind, her quiet but firm refusal of his direct help. He had spent his entire life solving problems, thinking his way through challenges, yet this was different. This was not about power, influence, or money. It was about dignity, about finding a way to give without making it feel like charity. He tapped his fingers against the edge of his desk, deep in thought. Then, slowly, an idea began to form. If Maribel would not accept help for herself, then perhaps she would accept help for others. He knew her heart, knew that she had spent her entire life giving to others, never thinking of herself first. That was the key. He reached for his phone, dialing the number of his assistant. "I need a team," he said as soon as she answered. "Legal, financial, nonprofit specialists. Get me the best people working in community development and social impact projects. We're going to create something new." Over the next few days, Morgan poured himself into the details of his plan. He envisioned a foundation, one that would provide meaningful opportunities for elderly caregivers, especially those who had spent their lives taking care of others without any financial security of their own. It would not be a handout. It would be a recognition of their value, a way to uplift without diminishing their sense of independence. The foundation would establish a program where experienced caregivers could mentor and train young people entering the field. Their wisdom would be shared, their experience valued, and in return, they would receive not just financial stability, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Maribel would never accept money just for herself, but if she knew she was helping others like her, that would change everything. Once the framework was in place, Morgan arranged for a meeting with Maribel. He picked her up himself, insisting that they take a short drive out of the city. She was reluctant at first, but he reassured her with a warm smile. "Trust me," he said. "I want to show you something." As they drove, Maribel looked out at the passing scenery, the towering buildings giving way to smaller neighborhoods, then open spaces where the air felt lighter, freer. Finally, they arrived at a large, welcoming building surrounded by gardens and shaded walkways. The sign at the entrance read, "The Guardian's Legacy, honoring those who have cared for us." Maribel frowned, reading the words again as she slowly stepped out of the car. "What is this place, Morgan?" He gestured for her to follow him inside. The interior was bright and spacious, filled with warm light and comfortable spaces. There were small classrooms, a library, a communal gathering area. But the most important part was the people. Older men and women, many of whom had worked as caregivers, nannies, and home aides, now engaged in teaching younger caregivers, sharing stories and skills, their faces alight with a sense of importance. A woman in her 70s was patiently demonstrating how to soothe a crying infant to a group of young nursing students. Nearby, an elderly man was teaching a small class about the emotional aspects of elderly care, drawing from decades of experience. "Maribel," Morgan said gently, watching as she took it all in, "this is what I wanted to show you. This place was built to honor people like you, people who have spent their lives taking care of others. It's not charity. It's a way to ensure that their knowledge, their experience, their value is never forgotten. She turned to look at him, her eyes searching. And what does this have to do with me? Morgan smiled. I need someone to help shape this program, to guide it, to make sure it truly serves the people it was meant to help. Someone with real experience, someone who understands what it means to give your life to others. He paused, then added, I need you, Maribel. Her expression softened, but she was still hesitant. Morgan, He held up a hand. Before you say no, think about this. You wouldn't be taking anything. You would be giving. Giving your wisdom, your heart, your leadership, and in return you'd be part of something bigger than any of us. Maribel looked around again, her eyes lingering on the elderly mentors speaking with young caregivers, the atmosphere of respect and warmth that filled the space. Slowly she nodded. You really thought this through, didn't you? Morgan chuckled. You always told me to think before I act, she exhaled, shaking her head with a small, knowing smile. You found a way to help me without making me feel like a burden. No, Morgan corrected softly. I found a way to remind you how much you still have to offer. Maribel looked at him for a long moment, then reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. All right, she said finally. I'll do it. Morgan felt a deep sense of relief and gratitude. She had accepted, not out of obligation, but because she truly saw the value in what they were creating. And as they walked through the halls of the Guardian's legacy, he knew this was just the beginning of something far greater than either of them could have imagined. Morgan Freeman sat in his study late into the night, surrounded by stacks of papers, reports, and financial projections. The weight of what he was about to do settled deep in his chest, not as a burden, but as a purpose. Meeting Maribel Vega had opened his eyes in ways he never anticipated. He had spent decades advocating for justice, lending his voice to causes that mattered. But for the first time, he saw the urgency of a problem that had gone unnoticed for too long. Across the country, thousands of elderly caregivers, housekeepers, and workers like Maribel had dedicated their lives to taking care of others, only to find themselves with nothing in return. No safety net, no security, still working grueling hours just to survive. That reality was unacceptable, and he was determined to change it. His vision was clear, a foundation that would not just offer financial support, but would create a sustainable system where aging caregivers could find dignity, purpose, and community. He didn't want to simply write checks or offer one-time grants. This needed to be something deeper, something lasting. He named it the Guardian's Legacy, a tribute to the people who had dedicated their lives to nurturing others but had been forgotten in their own time of need. The first step was acquiring the right properties. He instructed his legal and real estate teams to look for unused or underutilized buildings in cities where the need was greatest. His requirements were specific, locations that could be transformed into vibrant living and learning centers, not just homes for the elderly, but spaces where they could actively participate in society. Within weeks, his team identified 3 properties, one in Atlanta, another in Chicago, and a third in Los Angeles. Each site was large enough to accommodate housing units, training spaces, and community gathering areas. The next phase was designing the program itself. He didn't want these centers to feel like retirement homes or charity shelters. He wanted them to be hubs of intergenerational learning and mentorship. The idea was simple yet profound. Elderly caregivers would pass on their knowledge and life experience to younger generations while receiving the support they needed to live with dignity. In exchange for their time mentoring young caregivers, teaching parenting workshops, or participating in educational programs, they would receive subsidized housing, health care, and financial stipends that allowed them to finally rest without fear of poverty. To ensure the program was structured effectively, he sought the advice of educators, social workers, and even business leaders who had experience in nonprofit sustainability. The goal was to create a self-sustaining ecosystem where the wisdom of older generations was not just preserved, but actively utilized. One of his most ambitious ideas was to partner with childcare and healthcare training institutions. These facilities often struggled to provide real-world experience to their students. And the Guardian's legacy would fill that gap by allowing aspiring caregivers to learn directly from those who had spent their lives in service. It was a mutually beneficial relationship. The students received invaluable hands-on experience, and the elderly mentors gained a renewed sense of purpose. Funding the project was the next challenge. Morgan knew he could finance the initial launch himself, but for long-term sustainability, he needed more than just personal wealth. He reached out to philanthropic organizations, private investors, and corporations that had a stake in elder care and workforce development. He spoke passionately in boardrooms, on talk shows, and at public events, sharing Maribel's story as an example of a systemic failure that needed immediate action. People listened. Within months, multiple organizations pledged their support, including a major healthcare provider that agreed to offer free medical services to residents and a financial institution that sponsored retirement planning workshops for aging workers. With the funding secured, construction and renovations began. The first center, located in Atlanta, was a former educational facility that was redesigned to include private living spaces, communal kitchens, classrooms, and a wellness center. Each resident would have their own space, but also access to shared areas where they could interact, teach, and learn. The gardens were designed for both beauty and function, featuring raised beds where residents could grow vegetables and herbs, an activity that encouraged movement and provided fresh food for the community. As the project took shape, Morgan personally visited each site, speaking with future residents and listening to their stories. Many, like Maribel, had spent decades raising other people's children, cleaning homes, or working as caregivers without ever receiving recognition. Some had heartbreaking stories of being dismissed without pensions, of struggling with health issues because they couldn't afford medical care, of being alone with no family to turn to. Yet in each conversation he found resilience. These were people who had spent their lives giving, and they still had more to give if only given the chance. Maribel was one of the first to see the Atlanta Center before it officially opened. As Morgan walked her through the halls explaining how the program would work, she listened carefully, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "So," she finally said, her voice thoughtful, "you're not just helping us, you're making sure we're still needed." Morgan nodded. "That's the point. You have value, Maribel. You always have. This isn't about giving you something you don't deserve. It's about making sure the world recognizes what you and so many others have contributed." She was quiet for a moment before turning to him with a small but proud smile. "You did good, Morgan. This is something real." Hearing those words meant more to him than any award or accolade he had received in his career. On the day of the official launch, hundreds of people gathered outside the Atlanta Center. Reporters, city officials, and community members came to witness the unveiling of something truly groundbreaking. Morgan stood before them, a microphone in hand, but before he spoke, he turned to Maribel, who was seated in the front row. "This," he said, gesturing around, "exists because of you. Because of the lessons you taught me. Because of the love and care you gave to a little boy who grew up to realize that no one should ever be forgotten." Tears welled in her eyes, but she simply nodded, holding her head high as the applause rang out. As the first residents moved in, Morgan watched from a distance, knowing that this was only the beginning. The Guardian's legacy wasn't just about Maribel. It was about changing the way society valued those who had spent their lives in service. It was about making sure that no one who had given so much would ever be left to struggle alone again. And as he walked through the hallways of the center, listening to the voices of elders sharing their stories, their laughter mingling with the eager questions of young caregivers, he knew that this was the most important role he had ever played. Maribel Vega had never been one to accept handouts. She had spent her entire life working, relying on no one but herself, and even now, at 85, the idea of being on the receiving end of generosity unsettled her. But as she walked through the halls of the Guardian's legacy, she found herself in a position she had never anticipated. One where she was not a worker, not a caretaker, but a person who was valued for who she was, rather than what she could do for others. It had taken weeks of conversations, of gentle persuasion from Morgan Freeman, and the undeniable evidence of the purpose behind this project, for her to even consider stepping into this new life. Yet even after agreeing, a part of her still hesitated, unsure of what it meant to truly accept a gift that wasn't a charity, but an acknowledgement of a lifetime of service. Her transition into this new role wasn't immediate. The first few weeks were filled with a cautious adjustment, a quiet skepticism that lingered in the back of her mind as she settled into her new living space. The apartment was modest but beautiful, a far cry from the cramped quarters she had known for years. The shift in mindset came gradually, and not just because of the physical comfort she now had. It came in small, unexpected moments. Like when a younger woman approached her in the common room, hesitating before asking for advice on handling a stubborn toddler. Maribel had smiled, her instincts kicking in before she could overthink it, and suddenly she was sharing stories, tips, little tricks she had learned over decades of caring for children. The woman hung on to every word, nodding, taking notes, and when she thanked Maribel, there was something different in her voice. It wasn't pity, it wasn't condescension, it was respect. That respect was something Maribel had never truly received for her knowledge before. In her years as a nanny, a housekeeper, a caregiver, she had always been the one in the background, her presence expected but rarely acknowledged beyond the job itself. Here, though, things were different. The younger caregivers, the students, the single parents attending workshops, they all looked at her and the other elders as mentors, as sources of wisdom, rather than just old people who had outlived their usefulness. It was that realization, more than anything, that began to change the way she saw this new chapter of her life. One of her first official contributions to the Guardian's legacy was through storytelling sessions. At first, she wasn't sure she had anything to offer beyond practical knowledge, but when she sat down with a group of young parents and began telling them about the children she had cared for, the lessons she had learned from them, the struggles she had witnessed, she realized just how much her experiences resonated. They laughed at her anecdotes, nodded solemnly at her insights, and by the end of the session, several of them lingered, eager to ask more questions. One young father even admitted that he had never had someone in his life who had taught him how to be patient with his child. It wasn't just the parents and caregivers who benefited from Maribel's presence, though. The other elderly residents also found themselves gravitating toward her, drawn to her quiet strength and the way she carried herself with dignity despite all she had endured. For many of them, this was the first time in their lives that they had been part of something where they were not simply waiting out their final years, but were actively contributing to something greater than themselves. They swapped stories of past jobs, of the families they had worked for, and in doing so, they found a sense of solidarity that had been missing from their lives for so long. Morgan visited often, checking in on Maribel, watching as she slowly but surely stepped into this new reality. He saw the way she carried herself differently now, no longer weighed down by the exhaustion of working to survive. There was still the same fire in her eyes, the same strength that had carried her through a lifetime of hardship, but now it was accompanied by something softer: contentment. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench overlooking the community garden, he asked her how she was adjusting. "It's strange," she admitted, her fingers tracing the edge of a worn scarf she had wrapped around her shoulders, "to have people look at me and see something other than just an old woman who cleans tables. I didn't think I needed that, but maybe I did." Morgan smiled, nodding. "You've always had value, Maribel. The world just needed to catch up to recognizing it." She chuckled at that, shaking her head. "You always were good with words." But even as she grew more comfortable in this new life, there were still moments of doubt, moments where she wondered if she truly belonged here. That doubt, however, was slowly eroded by the undeniable evidence of the impact she was having. One evening, as she was preparing to turn in for the night, she heard a soft knock at her door. When she opened it, she found a young woman standing there, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her voice trembling, "but I didn't know who else to talk to." Maribel invited her in, listened as the woman poured out her fears about motherhood, about feeling like she wasn't good enough, about struggling to balance work and raising her child alone. And in that moment, Maribel knew exactly why she was here. She wasn't just being helped, she was helping. Over time, the hesitation, the fear of accepting this new role faded. She no longer felt like an outsider in her own life, no longer felt the need to justify her presence. She belonged here, not because someone had given her a place, but because she had earned it. Because she had something to give, and for the first time in decades, people were truly listening. As the months passed, she became a pillar of the community within the Guardian's legacy. She led workshops, mentored young caregivers, and, in her own way, became a living testament to the very mission of the program. And though she would never admitted it outright, she was happy. Maribel Vega had spent most of her life working in the shadows, quietly shaping the lives of the children she cared for, giving them warmth, wisdom, and love, while expecting nothing in return. But now, standing beside Morgan Freeman, she found herself at the center of something far greater than she had ever imagined. The Guardian's legacy had already transformed her life, and now, with Morgan's vision and determination, they were about to expand that impact to countless others. It was no longer just about her. It was about creating something lasting, something that could change the way the world treated people like her. Elderly caregivers, forgotten workers, those who had spent their lives giving but had received so little in return. Morgan had always been known for using his voice for meaningful causes, and as he saw Maribel stepping into her own power, he knew that together they could do something extraordinary. The idea started simply enough. Morgan had been watching Maribel thrive in her role at the Guardian's legacy, seeing her influence stretch far beyond what she had ever imagined. He saw young parents hanging on to her every word, struggling caregivers finally receiving the guidance they so desperately needed, and the elderly residents finding purpose again in sharing their knowledge. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, he turned to her and said, "What if we took this further?" Maribel raised an eyebrow. "Further?" He nodded. "This place has changed lives, but it's just one place. What if we built more? What if we created something that could reach not just dozens, but thousands?" She frowned, considering his words carefully. "You're talking about making this bigger, expanding?" "Not just expanding," Morgan said, "revolutionizing." The more they talked, the more the idea took shape. They wouldn't just create more centers like the Guardian's legacy. They would build a movement, one that would redefine how society valued its caregivers. They envisioned a network of communities where retired caregivers could live with dignity, where their skills would be respected and utilized, where young families and struggling parents could turn to them for guidance. It wouldn't be a charity. It would be a mutually beneficial exchange, one where experience and wisdom were recognized as valuable resources rather than forgotten relics of the past. And it wouldn't just be in one city. They would take it global. The first step was finding the right locations. Maribel, ever the pragmatist, insisted that they start in places where the need was greatest. Communities with large numbers of elderly workers struggling to make ends meet, single parents in desperate need of support, and children who would benefit from intergenerational mentorship. Morgan, with his resources and connections, began working with real estate developers, securing buildings and land that could be transformed into vibrant, thriving communities. They collaborated with architects to design spaces that were not just functional but beautiful, places where people would want to live, places that fostered connection and growth. At the same time, they reached out to educators, psychologists, and social workers, crafting a curriculum that would ensure these communities were more than just homes. They would be learning centers, places where life skills were passed down, where knowledge was preserved, where children could be nurtured not just by their parents, but by a whole generation of experienced caregivers. The more they built, the more they realized just how powerful this could be. They weren't just creating housing, they were creating a new way of thinking about aging, about caregiving, about the cycles of giving and receiving that sustain humanity. The media took notice almost immediately. A story about Morgan Freeman and an elderly former caregiver building a revolutionary community for retired workers and struggling families spread like wildfire. Interviews, talk show appearances, and features in major publications followed, with Maribel reluctantly stepping into the spotlight. She had never been one for attention, but as she sat beside Morgan in a televised interview, speaking about the importance of dignity in aging, about the value of wisdom and experience, she realized that this was bigger than her own discomfort. This was about something far greater. Investors, philanthropists, and activists began reaching out, eager to contribute to the cause. Governments and nonprofit organizations wanted to implement similar models in their own communities. What started as one small project had become a global initiative. Marabella and Morgan traveled across the country and eventually the world, visiting communities, speaking with caregivers, listening to their stories, and refining their model to ensure that it was adaptable to different cultures and economic realities. As the first international locations opened, the impact became undeniable. In one city, a struggling single mother found support from an elderly woman who had once been a nanny, learning parenting techniques that transformed her relationship with her son. In another, a retired caregiver who had been living in poverty found new purpose mentoring young women entering the field of early childhood education. Everywhere they went, they saw lives changing, people finding meaning, connections forming that had been impossible in the isolation of modern society. But beyond the numbers, beyond the success stories, there was something deeper happening. People were beginning to rethink the way they viewed aging, the way they treated those who had spent their lives in service to others. Companies began implementing new policies to support caregivers. Communities started integrating intergenerational programs. The conversation was shifting, and Maribel and Morgan were at the heart of it. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning, they sat together in the quiet of one of the newly opened centers. The laughter of children echoed in the distance, mingling with the voices of elderly residents sharing stories on a nearby patio. Maribel looked around, shaking her head in amazement. "I never imagined this," she admitted. Morgan smiled, watching the joy on her face. "Neither did I," he said. But that's the thing about change. It starts with something small, and then suddenly it's everywhere." She turned to him, eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing in this, for believing in me." Morgan shook his head. "You did this, Maribel. I just made sure the world saw what I always knew. You were never just a caregiver. You were a leader." And as they sat there, watching the community they had built come to life, they knew that this was only the beginning, because once the world had seen what was possible, there was no turning back. The Guardian's legacy had started as one woman's fight for dignity. Now, it was a movement that would change the world forever. Morgan Freeman had always understood the importance of gratitude. Throughout his career, he had spoken often about the mentors, colleagues, and family members who had shaped his journey, but it wasn't until he reconnected with Maribel Vega that he truly grasped the depth of what it meant to be grateful, not just in words, but in actions, in presence, in the quiet acknowledgement of those who had given so much without expectation. It was a lesson that went beyond the accolades and material wealth he had accumulated over the years, a realization that the most profound connections in life were built not on status or success, but on the simple act of recognizing and honoring those who had uplifted him along the way. Sitting in the heart of the Guardian's legacy, watching Maribel move through the courtyard with a group of young caregivers hanging on to her every word, he felt a profound sense of clarity. This wasn't just about giving back in the way society often framed it, through donations or financial support. It was about being fully present, about truly seeing people, about acknowledging their contributions in ways that made them feel valued and respected. He thought back to his childhood, to the quiet sacrifices Maribel had made for him, the way she had been there in moments when he felt lost, offering guidance without judgment, nurturing his curiosity and reminding him, time and time again, that he was capable of greatness even before he believed it himself. As the project expanded, Morgan found himself reflecting more deeply on the nature of human connection. He had spent a lifetime in an industry that often placed value on visibility, on the roles played, the awards won, the recognition received. But what he was witnessing here was something far more profound. Maribel had never sought acknowledgement for the lives she had shaped, yet the impact of her work was immeasurable. She had planted seeds in people's hearts, seeds that had grown into confidence, resilience, and kindness. And now, through this community, through the thousands of lives being changed, her influence was being carried forward in ways neither of them had ever anticipated. One evening, as they sat together beneath the soft glow of the courtyard lights, Morgan turned to Maribel and asked, "Did you ever regret it?" She looked at him, puzzled. "Regret what, Nino?" He gestured around them, at the community they had built, at the years of sacrifice she had endured. "Not having more for yourself, not asking for more." Maribel smiled, shaking her head gently. I have always had enough. Maybe not in the way the world measures it, but in the ways that matter. Her words stayed with him long after that night. He had always believed in the power of giving, but now he was beginning to understand the deeper layer beneath it, the idea that true generosity wasn't about offering what was left over, but about creating something that honored the dignity of others, that reinforced their worth rather than diminishing it. He had witnessed people giving in ways that uplifted and in ways that unknowingly condescended, and the difference lay in intention. Was it about making oneself feel good, or was it about truly recognizing the value of another human being? This realization shifted something within him. It wasn't just about helping Maribel or the elderly caregivers in their network. It was about shifting the way society viewed gratitude itself, about moving beyond transactional generosity into something far more meaningful. Gratitude wasn't just about saying thank you or giving someone a gift in return for their kindness. It was about living in a way that honored the sacrifices others had made for you. It was about carrying their lessons forward, about ensuring that their efforts had not been in vain. With this new perspective, Morgan found himself approaching his work, his relationships, and even his daily interactions differently. He became more intentional in his conversations, more present in his engagements. He took the time to listen, not just to respond, but to truly hear. He reached out to mentors and friends he had lost touch with, not out of obligation, but out of a newfound desire to acknowledge their place in his journey. And in doing so, he felt a sense of fulfillment that no award or recognition had ever given him. He also saw this transformation in Maribel. She too had begun to embrace her role in ways he had never expected. Though she had initially resisted the idea of being a leader, she had come to realize that her experiences, her wisdom, and even her struggles had given her something invaluable to share. She wasn't just an advisor in the Guardian's legacy. She had become a storyteller, a mentor, a living testament to the power of resilience and purpose. One day, as Morgan watched her teach a group of young caregivers, he overheard her say, "We do not give because we have to. We give because we can. And when we do, we remind each other that we are not alone." It was such a simple truth, yet it carried an enormous weight. He had spent so much of his life focused on the idea of individual success, but what Maribel was teaching was the understanding that true fulfillment came not from what one achieved alone, but from how one lifted others along the way. In that moment, Morgan realized something else. Gratitude wasn't about repaying a debt. It wasn't about evening the scales or making things fair. Life was never fair, and if it were, Maribel would have never had to struggle the way she did. No, gratitude was about taking the gifts one had been given, whether love, wisdom, support, or opportunity, and using them to create more goodness in the world. It was about ensuring that the kindness extended to you didn't end with you, but became a bridge for others. As he walked through the community that evening, past the gardens Maribel had insisted they build, past the laughter of children learning from elderly mentors, past the quiet moments of connection happening all around him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A profound sense of peace. He had spent a lifetime chasing goals, striving for impact, and now, in the twilight of his years, he understood that the greatest legacy he could leave was not in his films or in his fame, but in the lives he had touched, in the lessons he had carried forward, in the quiet but powerful ways he had chosen to honor those who had shaped him. And so, as he sat beside Maribel that night, watching the stars as they had once done when he was just a boy full of dreams, he turned to her and simply said, "Thank you." Not because he felt he owed her, not because he wanted to make amends for the years lost between them, but because in that moment he understood the true weight of those words. And as she smiled back at him, he knew she understood it too. Morgan Freeman had always carried himself with a quiet dignity, a presence that commanded respect wherever he went, but with Maribel Vega, he found himself slipping back into the comfort of familiarity. The unguarded version of himself that had existed long before the world placed a spotlight on his every move. Their relationship had been forged in his childhood, in the warmth of bedtime stories and gentle scoldings, in the hands that bandaged his scraped knees and the voice that reassured him when the world felt too big to understand. Now, decades later, as they sat across from each other, sharing meals and reminiscing about the past, Morgan realized that time had not eroded the bond between them. It had only made it more precious. At first, Maribel had been hesitant to accept the closeness that Morgan offered so freely. She was a woman of immense pride, someone who had built a life through resilience and determination, and the idea of being cared for, even in the most subtle of ways, was difficult for her to accept. But Morgan, with his quiet persistence, their conversations stretched late into the night, filled with laughter, nostalgia, and the occasional wistfulness of lost time. Morgan had always been a storyteller by nature, but Maribel was the keeper of his earliest stories, the one who had witnessed the first sparks of his imagination long before the world had recognized his brilliance. She told him things he had long forgotten, how, as a boy, he would act out entire scenes from books they had read together, using different voices for every character, how he would ask endless questions about the world, never satisfied with simple answers, how he once built a makeshift telescope from household scraps just to see the stars up close. "You always had a mind that reached beyond what was in front of you," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch, the soft hum of the evening air settling around them. "Even as a child, you weren't content with what was. You always wanted to know what could be." Morgan smiled, shaking his head at the memory. "And you were the first person who ever made me believe that was a good thing," he admitted. Maribel reached over, patting his hand in the familiar way she used to when he was young. "Because it was, Nino," she said simply. As the days passed, their relationship deepened in ways that neither of them had expected. Morgan found himself looking forward to their conversations, to the way Maribel challenged him to think beyond his fame and fortune, to question what truly mattered. And in turn, Maribel found herself letting go of the walls she had built over the years, allowing herself to trust that, this time, she didn't have to be the one carrying the weight of the world alone. One afternoon, as they sat in the courtyard of the Guardian's Legacy, watching the residents interact with one another, Maribel turned to Morgan with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she began, her voice softer than usual, "for a long time, I thought my life had already given me all it was going to give. I thought the best years were behind me, that everything after was just surviving." Morgan looked at her, waiting for her to continue. "But these past few months," she said, glancing around at the community they had built, at the people whose lives had been changed because of their efforts, "they've made me realize something, that there's still so much left to do, so much left to give." Morgan nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I think we both needed to be reminded of that," he said. And it was true. For all that he had accomplished, for all the roles he had played, Morgan had never felt as fulfilled as he did now, sitting beside Maribel, knowing that their work was making a real difference. There were moments, too, of quiet intimacy, of small gestures that spoke louder than any grand declaration. Morgan would often bring Maribel small surprises, her favorite tea, a book he thought she would like, a flower he picked from the garden because it reminded him of the ones she used to grow when he was a child. And Maribel, in turn, would scold him playfully when he forgot to eat between meetings, would remind him to rest when she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, would offer wisdom in the way only she could. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Maribel turned to him and said, "You know, Nino, I think of you as my own." Morgan swallowed the lump in his throat, his voice quiet when he spoke. "And I think of you as mine," he admitted. There was a long pause before Maribel reached over, squeezing his hand gently. "Then we are family," she said simply. And just like that, something inside Morgan settled. For years, he had carried the weight of the past, the what-ifs and could-have-beens, the questions that had never been answered. But in that moment, with Maribel beside him, he realized that what truly mattered wasn't what had been lost. It was what they had found again. Their bond, forged in childhood and tested by time, had remained unbroken, and now, as they moved forward together, it was stronger than ever. Morgan Freeman had always been a man of wisdom, patience, and quiet strength. But as he spent more time with Maribel Vega, he found himself reflecting on the deeper lessons she had imparted throughout his life, lessons that, unbeknownst to him, had shaped the very core of his character. Maribel had always taught through action rather than words, instilling in him the values of resilience, compassion, and the importance of seeing people beyond their circumstances. Now, as he moved forward with his work, his relationships, and his personal philosophy, he realized that those lessons had been present in every decision he had ever made. But for the first time, he began to consciously apply them, allowing himself to be more intentional in the way he lived his life. In his career, Morgan had always chosen roles that carried depth, stories that had meaning, and characters that reflected the human condition. But now, with Maribel's influence fresh in his mind, he found himself seeking projects that not only entertained, but also educated and inspired. He became more selective, ensuring that each role he took on aligned with his values. Stories that highlighted perseverance, dignity, and the triumph of the human spirit. He began producing and funding projects that gave a voice to the unheard, using his platform not just to showcase his talent, but to create impact. Beyond Hollywood, he became more involved in philanthropic efforts, but not in the traditional sense. Maribel had always emphasized the importance of personal involvement, of understanding the people one wished to help, rather than simply throwing money at a cause. So instead of just writing checks, Morgan took the time to visit the communities he was supporting, to listen to their stories, to sit with them and understand their struggles. Whether it was supporting struggling artists, funding education programs, or helping veterans transition to civilian life, he ensured that his presence was felt, that the people he was helping knew they were seen. His interactions with people also changed. He had always been kind and approachable, but now he made an effort to truly connect, to listen in the way that Maribel had listened to him as a child. He took the time to learn the names of the people who worked behind the scenes in his productions, the assistants, the stagehands, the catering crew, making them feel valued in a way that was often overlooked in an industry driven by fame and status. He greeted waitstaff by name, engaged in conversations with taxi drivers, and made an effort to acknowledge those who were often ignored. But perhaps the most profound changes were in his personal life. He had spent much of his career constantly moving, always busy, always focused on the next project, the next goal. But Maribel had reminded him of the importance of being present, of slowing down enough to appreciate the people who mattered. He reconnected with old friends he hadn't seen in years, reaching out not just for professional collaborations, but for the simple joy of rekindling relationships. He spent more time with his family, ensuring that his loved ones knew they were a priority rather than an afterthought. He also began mentoring young actors and filmmakers, taking a personal interest in guiding those who were just starting out. He saw in them the same hunger, the same passion he had once had, and he wanted to be the person for them that Maribel had been for him. Someone who believed in their potential, who nurtured their dreams with patience and encouragement. He didn't just offer advice, he offered opportunities, introducing them to people who could help them, guiding them through the often unforgiving industry, with the kind of support that could make all the difference. Even in the simplest aspects of life, he found himself applying Maribel's lessons. He made a conscious effort to show gratitude for the small things: a beautifully prepared meal, a handwritten note from a fan, the sound of laughter shared between friends. He took moments to breathe, to truly see the world around him rather than just moving through it. He found joy in helping others not out of obligation but out of genuine care, understanding now that true success was not measured in accolades, but in the lives one touched. One afternoon, as he sat with Maribel in the courtyard of Guardian Angel's village, watching the residents engage in laughter and conversation, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, his voice filled with quiet appreciation, "I used to think that success was about what I could achieve, about how far I could go. But You've reminded me that success is just as much about what you give back." Maribel smiled, her aged but warm eyes holding a depth of understanding. "True success, Nino, is about the legacy you leave behind," she said gently. "Not in awards or wealth, but in the people whose lives you've changed." Morgan nodded, knowing in his heart that she was right. He had spent decades building a career that would be remembered, but now, more than ever, he wanted his life to be remembered not just for what he had done, but for the kindness he had shown, the wisdom he had shared, and the people he had lifted along the way. And as he looked at Maribel, at the woman who had shaped him long before he knew the weight of his own name, he realized that she had already created a legacy, one that lived within him, within the countless others she had cared for, and within the generations that would carry her lessons forward. It was a legacy built not on fame or fortune, but on love, resilience, and the quiet power of believing in someone when they needed it most. And now it was his turn to pass it on. The story of Maribel Vega and Morgan Freeman quickly became more than just a tale of a chance reunion. It became a testament to the power of human connection, resilience, and the lasting impact of kindness. When the media caught wind of Morgan's efforts to honor Maribel's influence in his life and his mission to uplift caregivers like her, the narrative spread like wildfire. People across the world resonated with the depth of their bond. A boy once nurtured by a woman who saw his potential, now a man in a position of immense influence, giving back in the most meaningful way possible. The impact was immediate, but the ripples of their story continued to grow, touching the hearts of millions and inspiring tangible change. News outlets, journalists, and television programs all wanted to cover their journey. Documentaries were pitched, interviews were scheduled, and social media platforms were flooded with discussions about the importance of recognizing the silent figures who shape our lives. People began sharing their own stories. Nannies who had become second mothers, teachers who had gone beyond the curriculum to change lives, caregivers who had sacrificed their own comfort to nurture others. Hashtags like "Honor Your Heroes" and "Unsung Angels" began trending, encouraging people to reach out and express gratitude to those who had made a difference in their lives. Beyond the media frenzy, the real transformation took place in communities across the country. Inspired by Morgan's actions, individuals and organizations alike started taking steps to support elderly caregivers, acknowledging that people like Maribel Vega were everywhere. Women and men who had spent their lives caring for others but had been left to struggle in their later years. Donations poured into retirement funds for caregivers, scholarships were established for their families, and businesses began reassessing how they treated their longtime employees. Companies and industries that relied heavily on domestic workers and caregivers started implementing better pension plans, healthcare benefits, and financial assistance for those approaching retirement. Schools and universities took notice as well. Educators began incorporating discussions about the value of caregiving into their curriculums, emphasizing emotional intelligence and social responsibility. Students were encouraged to engage with elders in their communities, fostering a deeper sense of empathy and appreciation for the contributions of past generations. College programs that focused on social work and elder care saw a spike in interest as young people felt inspired to dedicate their careers to making a difference in the lives of those who had spent decades serving others. The Guardian Angels Village, Morgan's ambitious project dedicated to providing security and purpose to retired caregivers, became a model for similar initiatives worldwide. Cities from Los Angeles to London began exploring ways to establish similar communities, ensuring that those who had once nurtured others would never have to struggle in their final years. Philanthropists and business leaders stepped forward, offering funding and expertise to expand the program, while volunteers flooded in, eager to learn from the wisdom of the village's residents. The model didn't just provide housing, it created a movement, one that emphasized dignity, respect, and the value of intergenerational knowledge. Even in the entertainment industry, where Morgan had spent his life, the shift was noticeable. Filmmakers and screenwriters, inspired by the raw emotion of his journey with Maribel, began crafting stories that highlighted the unseen struggles of caregivers. Biopics and dramas centered around nannies, grandparents, and mentors gained popularity, reshaping cultural narratives about aging and gratitude. Award shows dedicated special segments to honoring real-life caregivers, bringing visibility to those who had long been overlooked. Morgan himself championed these efforts, ensuring that the spotlight wasn't just on him, but on the countless Maribels of the world. The most touching moments, however, came from the individuals who reached out directly. Morgan received thousands of letters from people who had reconnected with their childhood caretakers after hearing his story. Some had found their former nannies living in poverty and had stepped in to help, while others had simply reached out to express their gratitude. Elderly caregivers who had felt forgotten suddenly found themselves receiving phone calls, letters, and visits from the children they had once raised, now grown adults with lives of their own, finally taking the time to say thank you. Maribel, initially overwhelmed by the attention, found herself deeply moved by the stories she read, In her quiet humility, she never saw herself as someone special, but as she read letter after letter, she began to understand the magnitude of what she represented. She wasn't just one woman whose kindness had shaped a boy's future. She was a symbol of countless others, a reminder to the world of the power of unconditional love and devotion. One evening, as Morgan and Maribel sat together in the courtyard of Guardian Angel's village, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Did you ever imagine it would come to this, Nino?" she asked, using the affectionate nickname she had always called him. Morgan smiled, shaking his head. "Never. I only wanted to help you. I had no idea the world would listen." Maribel nodded, gazing at the gardens where residents were tending to flowers, exchanging laughter, and enjoying the peace they had long deserved. "It's a strange thing, isn't it?" she mused. "How something so small, just caring for someone, can grow into something this big." Morgan took a deep breath, letting the weight of her words settle over him. "That's how change happens," he said finally. "Not through grand gestures, but through simple acts of kindness that inspire others to do the same." She reached over, placing a weathered but steady hand over his. "You have done something truly beautiful, Morgan. But never forget, you were always meant for this." In that moment, he realized the full depth of what she meant. This wasn't just about repaying a debt of gratitude. It wasn't just about making amends for the past or ensuring that Maribel was taken care of. This was about continuing a legacy of love, about proving that kindness has the power to shape lives in ways no one can predict. And as the stars began to twinkle above them, he knew that their story was far from over. It was only the beginning of something much greater, a movement of compassion, of connection, and of honoring the silent heroes who had shaped the world from behind the scenes. Maribel Vega had spent a lifetime in the service of others, dedicating her youth and strength to caring for children who were not her own, ensuring they grew up with kindness, wisdom, and a sense of wonder about the world. Now, in the final chapter of her life, she finally found herself in a place where she no longer had to worry about making ends meet, where she could wake up each morning without the ache of exhaustion pressing against her bones, where she could take deep breaths of the fresh morning air without the weight of survival hanging over her. For the first time in decades, she lived not out of necessity but out of choice, and that more than anything brought her peace. Guardian Angel's village had become her sanctuary, a place where she was not just a resident, but a guiding presence, a source of wisdom and a quiet pillar of strength for those around her. Her mornings were no longer rushed with the urgency of labor, but instead filled with moments of quiet reflection. She would sit by her window with a warm cup of tea, gazing at the garden as the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold. The scent of freshly bloomed jasmine drifted in through the open window, and she found herself savoring the simple pleasure of just being. No alarms, no rigid schedules, no back-to-back shifts that left her too tired to dream. Only the gentle rhythm of life, unfolding at its own pace. She had a routine, but this time it was one that brought her joy rather than obligation. Some mornings she would walk through the gardens, her steps unhurried, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin, the cool breeze rustling through her silver hair. The soil beneath her fingertips felt rich with life, and she took great pleasure in tending to the small vegetable patch she had claimed as her own. She would hum softly as she planted tomatoes and peppers, just as she had once taught young Morgan Freeman to do when he was a curious boy full of questions about how things grew. Now, she found herself explaining the same lessons to the younger residents, the volunteers who came to learn from her, and even to Morgan's own grandchildren when they visited, their small hands eager to dig into the earth alongside hers. Afternoons were filled with conversations, laughter, and storytelling. Residents often gathered in the common area, where the air buzzed with the warmth of shared memories and hard-earned wisdom. Maribel had become somewhat of an elder among them, not just in age but in presence. Her stories, rich with history and emotion, had a way of drawing people in, making them listen, making them reflect. Young caregivers came to her for advice not just about their profession but about life itself, about patience, about perseverance, about finding meaning in even the smallest acts of kindness. She spoke softly but with the weight of experience. and those who listened often left with more than just words. They left with a deeper understanding of themselves. She also found a new passion in writing, something she had never had the luxury to pursue in her younger years. With a notebook and pen, she began recording her memories. Fragments of the past, lessons she had learned, moments that had shaped her. She wrote letters to people who had touched her life, some of whom were no longer around to read them, and she wrote about Morgan, about the boy she had loved as her own, the man he had become, and the incredible way their paths had intertwined once more. Some of her writings found their way into local publications, inspiring readers far beyond the walls of Guardian Angel's village. Morgan visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with his children or his mother, and each time he was greeted with the same warm embrace, the same affectionate scolding about whether he was taking care of himself. He had built so much, changed so many lives, yet when he sat with Maribel, he was still the boy who had once clung to her hand in search of comfort. Their conversations were no longer tinged with sorrow for what had been lost, but instead filled with gratitude for what had been found. They reminisced, they laughed, and sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, simply enjoying the presence of someone who had been, in so many ways, a constant in an ever-changing world. Despite all the recognition and admiration she had received, Maribel never sought the spotlight. She was content knowing that her story had made a difference, that her journey had meant something, not just to Morgan but to so many others who had been inspired to honor the caregivers in their own lives. She saw the way young people were beginning to look at their elders differently, the way families were reconnecting, the way gratitude was being expressed before it was too late. That, more than anything, was her greatest reward. As the seasons passed, her steps became slower, her hands a little weaker, but her spirit remained unshaken. She was surrounded by love, by a community that cherished her, by a family, both chosen and biological, that made sure she never felt alone. The fear of aging that had once loomed over her like a storm cloud had dissipated, replaced by the quiet acceptance that she had lived well, that she had given all she had to give, and that, at long last, she could rest. On her 90th birthday, the residents and staff of Guardian Angel's village threw her a celebration that was nothing short of magical. The courtyard was adorned with string lights, tables were set with flowers from the garden, and laughter filled the air as old friends and new gathered to honor the woman who had changed so many lives. Morgan himself led the toast, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of the impact Maribel had made, not just on him, but on the world. "You taught me," he said, raising his glass, "that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch, in the love we give, in the kindness we leave behind. And if that is the measure of a life well lived, then Maribel, you are the richest person I have ever known." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but they were not of sadness. They were of deep, profound gratitude. She had never needed recognition, but knowing that she had been seen, that her efforts had mattered, filled her with a warmth that words could not describe. That night, as she lay in bed, listening to the distant hum of the world outside, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time: complete and utter peace. She had spent her years giving, and now, at long last, she was receiving, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of love. And that, she thought as she closed her eyes, was all she had ever wanted. Morgan Freeman sat in his study, the soft glow of the evening sun casting long shadows across the walls lined with books, awards, and framed photographs from a lifetime of accomplishments. But in that moment, none of the accolades mattered as much as the memories that played in his mind. Memories of a journey that had reshaped not just his understanding of the past, but also his vision of the future. He had spent decades crafting a legacy through his films, his voice, his influence. But it was the quiet moments, the connections made along the way, that truly defined the impact of a life well lived. He thought of Maribel Vega, the woman who had once been a steady presence in his childhood, and how their unexpected reunion had unraveled truths he had never imagined. The realization that she had lived in struggle for so long while he had soared to heights of success had been a sobering one, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable disparities in life. The ways in which some people, no matter how kind, hardworking, or selfless, were left behind while others thrived. That realization had shifted something deep within him, a change that went beyond material gestures or philanthropy. It was not just about helping Maribel. It was about understanding the true meaning of gratitude, responsibility, and the power of using one's success to lift others in a way that preserved dignity rather than diminished it. He thought back to his earliest memories of Maribel, her gentle but firm hand guiding him through childhood, her stories that painted the world with wonder, her unwavering belief in him even when he doubted himself. She had been more than a caregiver, she had been a guardian of his dreams, nurturing the very seeds of curiosity and ambition that had led him to where he was now. And yet, he had gone so many years without thinking of her, assuming she had found her own path, never questioning what had happened after she left. It was a humbling thought to realize that while he had moved forward, she had been left behind in ways he never anticipated. But fate, or perhaps something greater, had brought them back together, and in doing so had given him the chance to rewrite the ending of her story. Not as an act of charity, but as an act of justice, of love, of acknowledging a debt that could never truly be repaid, but could at least be honored. Through Maribel, he had come to see his own life with fresh eyes. He had always known he had been fortunate, that his journey from humble beginnings to international recognition was not solely the result of talent but also of timing, of opportunities granted, of hands that had guided him along the way. But now, he saw more clearly the responsibility that came with that fortune. Success, he realized, was not meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared, to be used as a tool for change, for upliftment. He had given to charity before, had supported causes he believed in, but now he understood that true giving required more than just financial contributions. It required presence, commitment, and an understanding of the people behind the causes. The Guardian Angels Village was perhaps the most tangible result of that newfound understanding. What had started as a way to help Maribel had grown into something far greater, something that would outlive them both. It had become a refuge for those who had spent their lives in service, a place where dignity was restored, where wisdom was valued, where no one was forgotten simply because they had grown old. Every time he visited, he saw the lives it had changed. The former housekeepers, caregivers, and nannies who now had a place to call home, a place where they were not only cared for but also respected for the roles they had played in shaping the world from behind the scenes. Seeing their faces, hearing their laughter, watching them rediscover purpose in their later years. Those were the moments that felt more rewarding than any award he had ever received. And then there was Maribel herself. She had flourished in ways he could never have predicted, not just as a resident, but as a leader, a mentor, a source of inspiration for so many. He had worried at first that she would resist, that her pride would keep her from accepting the life he wanted to give her. But he had learned through patience and through listening that she did not need to be saved. She needed to be recognized, empowered, given the space to continue giving in a way that felt meaningful to her. And in the process, she had given him something even greater in return, a sense of grounding, a reminder of what truly mattered. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the framed photograph on his desk, a recent one taken at Maribel's 90th birthday celebration. In it, she stood surrounded by family, by friends, by the people whose lives she had touched in ways she might never fully comprehend. Morgan himself stood beside her, a hand resting on her shoulder, his smile genuine, unguarded, reflecting the profound gratitude he felt to have her in his life once more. It was a reminder that legacy was not just about what one built, but about the lives one touched, the people one lifted, the love one gave freely and without expectation of return. He had spent much of his career telling stories that moved people, that challenged them, that made them feel something. But the greatest story he had ever been part of was the one he had not written, the one that had unfolded naturally, unexpectedly, in the form of a second chance to make things right. It was a story of reunion, of redemption, of the quiet, unspoken ways in which love and gratitude could reshape a life. It was a story he would carry with him always, not just as a chapter in his own journey, but as a guiding force in everything he did moving forward. As the evening sky darkened, Morgan Freeman felt a sense of peace settle over him, the kind that came not from accomplishment, but from understanding. From knowing that he had done what he could, that he had honored the people who had shaped him, that he had used his voice, his influence, his success to create something that would outlast him. And in that he found solace, knowing that his legacy would not just be measured in films or awards, but in the lives he had touched, in the gratitude he had shown, in the love he had given. Because in the end, that was what truly mattered. Life is a journey filled with unexpected turns, and often the most profound lessons come not from grand successes, but from the relationships and experiences that shape us along the way. The story of Morgan Freeman and Maribel Vega is a testament to the enduring power of gratitude, human connection, and the importance of giving back in a way that preserves dignity and fosters true change. For older generations, this story holds deep meaning, reminding us that our past, no matter how distant, continues to shape our present, and that the wisdom we carry is not just valuable, but necessary in a world that sometimes forgets the voices of those who came before. One of the key messages from this journey is that kindness and mentorship have a lasting impact. Maribel, in her quiet, unassuming way, shaped Morgan's future not through wealth or power, but through simple, unwavering support and encouragement. She believed in him when he was just a child, instilled values of perseverance and curiosity, and helped him see the world not just as it was, but as it could be. Many older adults have played similar roles in the lives of younger generations, whether as parents, teachers, mentors, or caregivers. Yet it is easy to feel as though those contributions have been forgotten over time. The reality, however, is that the seeds of kindness and guidance we plant today can continue to grow for decades, influencing lives in ways we may never fully see or understand. Another important lesson is the true meaning of success. In a world that often measures achievement by wealth and accolades, this story reminds us that real success lies in the relationships we build and the impact we leave behind. Morgan Freeman had achieved everything society deems important: fame, fortune, influence. Yet it was reconnecting with Maribel and understanding her struggles that gave him a deeper sense of purpose. This is a powerful reminder for those who have lived long and seen much, that the legacy we leave is not in material wealth, but in the way we touch the lives of others. Whether through acts of kindness, shared wisdom, or simply being there for those who need us, we all have the power to create a lasting impact. The story also emphasizes that it is never too late to right a wrong, to reconnect, or to give back. Many older individuals carry regrets, things they wish they had done differently, people they lost touch with, opportunities they missed. But Maribel and Morgan's journey proves that there is always time to make things right, to heal old wounds, and to build something meaningful. Whether it is reaching out to an old friend, sharing knowledge with a younger generation, or simply embracing the idea that our contributions still matter, there is always an opportunity to create something valuable, regardless of age. Ultimately, this story serves as a beautiful reminder that life is about more than just personal success. It is about lifting others, about ensuring that no one is forgotten, and about recognizing that even the smallest acts of kindness can echo for generations. For those in their later years, it is a call to embrace the wisdom and experience they hold, to share their stories, and to take comfort in the fact that the love and lessons they have given throughout their lives continue to make a difference in ways they may never fully realize.